All right, in the first session we talked about what mixed methods research is, and in the second session we turn our attention to purposes and research designs of such mixed methods studies. We'll basically go into more detail and look at what are different ways of really using mixed methods research to its advantage. And again, from the paper which I've mentioned in the first session, Venkatesh et al. 2013, there's a table of different purposes of a mixed method study. Now, there are 7 purposes in total, and we will focus on the first 3. The first purpose is the developmental purpose. Basically, what that means is one strand, and if you have a qualitative part and a quantitative part in a research and a mixed methods research setting, then you would call them 2 strands. Now, one strand provides the hypotheses to be tested in the next one. That's the description of a developmental purpose. So, for example, you could, with a qualitative study, identify relevant factors of a phenomenon and then use them in the second strand, maybe a quantitative strand, and test those relationships with a larger sample that you can generalize from. An example for such a study from the field that we've been talking about, digital stress, is Khalif and colleagues' quite recent paper. He talked to, I think, 35 hospital care workers about digital stress, positive and negative sides of it, and he derived a model from it and the colleagues, and then they tested it based on a larger sample. And they found that some relationships maybe didn't turn out the way that they thought based on their qualitative data, so they went back to the qualitative data and saw, well, maybe there are some hints, maybe there's some reasons in there already why those relationships maybe didn't turn out to be significant in the larger population. So that's a developmental purpose. A second purpose would be an expansion purpose. Description, again, is to expand an understanding obtained in a previous strand of a study. For example, you could gain insights on the nature and cause of a relationship that you have previously tested in a quantitative study. And we will look at such an example in the readings, Frank and colleagues, and we'll see later on how they did that, how they expanded on quantitative findings through qualitative, richer insights on the nature of those quantitative relationships. And then the third one is complementarity. Here, the purpose is to gain complementary, or you could also say overlapping, views about a phenomenon or a relationship. So, for example, you could ask for stories for a richer understanding of the phenomena that you tested in your quantitative parts of the study. And there is an example that I will show later. It's an unpublished paper, but I put it on here as a reference. And the other ones are corroboration, completeness, compensation, and diversity. If you are interested in all the different purposes, then take a look at the paper Venkatesh and colleagues 2013. Now, one thing that's important is it is not necessary to force your research, your mixed methods research, into exactly one of those categories. But depending on the purpose, many of the design decisions of how you will conduct your research will be dictated, and they will basically fall into place. And that's probably for beginners, rather complicated issue, but we will talk about it a little bit and see if we can draw those connections in some examples. And that's exactly what we're doing here. As said, other design decisions follow. Firstly, we need to develop a strategy for our design, and that means we carefully select the design that is appropriate for the research questions and the objective and the context. Now that we've done that, let's take a look at different possible designs. And those different possible designs are separated by their time orientation and mixing strategy. What does that mean? Time orientation means you have those two strands, qualitative and quantitative. In which order do you use them? One option could be a concurrent nested design. That basically means you do it at the same time. You ask both the quantitative and the qualitative questions at the same time. So, for example, you could have a questionnaire that contains both quantitative questions with a Likert scale and qualitative open-ended questions. And if you have participants that are kind enough to really give qualitative answers at length to those open questions, then basically you collect quantitative and qualitative data at the same time. And then afterwards you analyze them both together. Now let's think about our three types of purposes. Let's say you had a developmental approach. You wanted to use the insights from the first strand to derive hypotheses and then test them with the second. You couldn't do that with a nested design because you're doing it at the same time. You cannot adjust the quantitative questions based on the insights and the qualitative results because you ask them both at the same time. And that's what I meant when I said it will fall into place. It doesn't work for a developmental design here. And let's jump all the way over to the other side because that might work for a developmental design. There you have a sequential design. So you start with the qualitative data collection, you analyze the qualitative data, and then based on those findings, you ask questions in your quantitative study, and then again collect the data and analyze that data. So that is a design that works for a developmental purpose. The third one is the concurrent triangulation design. Concurrent again means at the same time, but not nested, not at the same time. Maybe you have interviews and you have a questionnaire, but you have the participants in the room, right? You give them a quick questionnaire, they fill it out, and then afterwards you talk about it, but you didn't have time to analyze the data. You didn't have time to analyze the questions that or how they responded in the questionnaire. So basically what you could do, you could analyze both of those data types and then compare those results in a triangulation design. Again, the purpose guides the strategy. For example, for the developmental purpose, sequential design is necessary because the first strand informs the second one. We have some examples in the readings and we will talk about them in the live session, but let's go over them briefly here. This is one of the papers that you will read. It has a sequential design that aims at the purpose of expansion. It starts with digital trace data, analyzes different types of user behaviors, categorizes them into different behaviors. And then the question arose, well, why do we see these patterns? We need to understand better why these patterns exist. So we went and we talked to the users about it, and we said, well, do you maybe recognize this pattern? Is this a pattern that you've used before? And so we found reasons for those user roles in a sequential design with the aim of expansion. A second example would be one of a concurrent nested design. It's actually, I think, a very interesting way of collecting data, because you can do it all at the same time. You just ask a couple of open questions regarding phenomena that you are particularly interested, that you would like to know why maybe the relationships exist. And you can do it both at the same time, then test a model, and then find reasons for those relationships. Now, that might sound a little bit counterintuitive, because for confirmatory research, so for a model that you need to test, you want to test, you already need the theory, right? You talked about theoretical planes and empirical planes. You need hypotheses that you can test. But maybe those hypotheses don't have a lot of details for a specific context that you're interested in. Or you might not know if you will get a positive result if you have a significant relationships because they're competing hypotheses. And in that case, you could ask open-ended questions to get reasons for those relationships. All right, lastly, I would like to talk about ways to collect and analyze qualitative data really briefly. Now, one thing that is important in mixed methods research is that you don't do a hasty analysis of one strand, for example, the qualitative data in a quantitative dominant research inquiry, and then obviously do your quantitative data rigorously. That's not desirable. You need to give both types of data adequate attention, and you need to do a thorough job of analyzing and collecting the qualitative data. Now, there are some examples of how you can collect and analyze such data shown on this slide, but for reasons of time, we cannot go into detail in this course. But just to name some examples, you could, for example, ask open-ended survey questions, or you could conduct user interviews, expert interviews, or focus groups with multiple people at the same time. And to analyze them, you could use different coding approaches. There's a book that I can recommend here that describes different ways of coding qualitative data. One example would be a grounded theory coding with open codes, and then actual or theoretical coding as a follow-up to that. And a second option would be content analysis, where you already know the categories that you want to analyze. And other examples also exist for the analysis of qualitative data. So just make sure that you do a thorough job of analyzing the qualitative data if you're interested in conducting mixed methods research.